Our reading today is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. This is the word of Yahweh. Suppose a man enters into marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her, and so he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. She then leaves his house and goes off to become another man's wife. Then suppose the second man dislikes her, writes her a bill of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or the second man who married her dies. Her first husband, who sent her away, is not permitted to take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that would be abhorrent to Yahweh, and you shall not bring guilt on the land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you as a possession. It is important to note that the covenant of Sinai never commands divorce. To put it another way, there was no situation described in the covenant of Sinai in which divorce was required of the Israelites. In fact, the word translated into English as divorce by the New Revised Standard Version, the word keritut, only occurs 4 times in the First Testament. 2 appear here in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, and the word is used once in Isaiah chapter 50, verse 1, and once in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8. So it's not a common word. Keritut comes from the Hebrew root kaf resh tav, which in verbal form means to cut off or to cut down. So divorce is literally the severing or separation of 2 people who had been married. It's clear enough, therefore, that the covenant of Sinai never commanded married couples to be divorced, and that when it did occur, divorce was understood as a cutting apart of the 2 people. Both of these observations will prove critical to Jesus' understanding of divorce as preserved in the New Testament Gospels, which we'll consider in turn. Returning, though, for the time being to Deuteronomy chapter 24, the next question that arises is the conditions under which Moses anticipated divorce might occur among the people of Israel. Moses began with a hypothetical situation which he described as follows in verses 1 through 2. Suppose a man enters into marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her, and so he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. She then leaves his house and goes off to become another man's wife. Though the meaning of the phrase translated into English as something objectionable has been long debated both in Judaism and in Christianity, the meaning seems fairly straightforward in the context. The phrase in the original Hebrew is irvat devar, and we've already seen it used earlier in Deuteronomy. We might remember that irvat refers to indecent nakedness, and it was used in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 14 to describe defecating, urinating, or ejaculating within the confines of a military camp. So the occasion for this first divorce would have to do with some kind of indecent activity while naked. We can be sure that this would not have referred to evidence of sexual activity prior to marriage, because Deuteronomy chapter 22 verses 13 through 21 had already required that such an offense be punishable by death, not by divorce. We can also be sure that this would not refer to adultery which could be substantiated by 2 or 3 witnesses, because that too would have been punishable by death under the covenant of Sinai. Well, what if a husband suspected his wife of adultery, but the suspicion could not be sustained by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses? In that case, the covenant of Sinai had a way of determining the guilt or innocence of the suspected spouse. The process has been described in Numbers chapter 5 verses 11 through 31. In short, the man and woman were to present themselves before the priest, and the priest would make a special elixir, which, if the woman were guilty, would cause her great pain and make her infertile, but if she were innocent, would have no effect on her whatsoever. Obviously, God would have had to have been involved in the process to make it effective. However, Numbers did not specify what should be done with a woman who was found guilty through this process. She was not required explicitly to be executed, most likely due to the lack of 2 or 3 witnesses, but Numbers chapter 5 verse 31 says that she shall bear her iniquity. It seems reasonable that this would be an occasion in which a husband might write his wife a certificate of divorce. And adultery certainly would qualify as a form of indecent or shameful nakedness. However, due to the vagueness of the phrase in Hebrew, Moses most likely envisioned any number of situations in which a person engaged in indecent or shameful acts while naked that were not specified specifically as executable offenses in the covenant of Sinai might lead to a husband divorcing his wife. As we've already observed, the covenant of Sinai does not command divorce in these circumstances, but Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4 does appear to allow for divorce in these circumstances. Moses continued to explain that this hypothetical woman then went on to marry another man. This man, however, either disliked her and wrote her another certificate of divorce or died. This is an interesting hypothetical situation because the specific language of indecent nakedness does not occur here. In this case, hypothesized by Moses, the woman's second husband simply disliked her. The Hebrew phrase is usheneah hayish, and it could be translated literally, and he hated her. No reason for his hate has been specified, and yet the covenant of Sinai seems to permit divorce in this case as well. This led to a series of debates, still ongoing in the time of Jesus, in which some rabbis taught that divorce was only allowable under very specific circumstances, as seems the case in Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 2, while others believed it to be allowable in nearly any circumstance, as may be suggested by Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 3. We'll return to this debate shortly. However, divorce is only in the background of God's instruction through Moses in these verses. The real heart of the matter can be found in verse 4, which reads as follows: Her first husband, who sent her away, is not permitted to take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that would be abhorrent to Yahweh, and you shall not bring guilt on the land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving you as a possession. What Moses has explained is that a woman who has been divorced and remarried cannot return again to marry her first husband. Moses went on to explain that the reason for the prohibition is because she has been defiled in English. The Hebrew word is hutama'ah. It's a rare causative passive form of the verb tameh, which means to be or to become unclean, and it's generally understood to mean that she had become sexually defiled. So the question then is, does this refer to the reason for the first divorce, namely that her husband found her to have engaged in indecent activities while naked? Or is this something that occurred as a result of the second marriage? Moses did not explain the case further, so it's not surprising that the rabbinic tradition of Judaism debated the matter for a very long time. However, all of this that we've just discussed was critical to Jesus' understanding of divorce. And for those of us who have accepted Jesus as the incarnate Word of God, for us, Jesus' teaching illuminates the true intention of this passage in the Covenant of Sinai. Jesus' teaching has been preserved in St. Mark's Gospel in Mark chapter 10 verses 2 through 12, and in the Gospel according to St. Matthew in Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 through 12. Here are both passages, beginning first with Mark chapter 10 verses 2 through 12. Some Pharisees came, and to test him they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." Then in the house the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." And now, Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 12. Some Pharisees came to him, and to test him they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that the one who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh'? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her?" He said to them, "It was because you were so hard-hearted that Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another, commits adultery. His disciples said to him, If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to them, Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. In terms of contrast, we might notice initially that Jesus seems to describe a condition in which divorce may be allowable in Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 through 12, which is not present in Jesus' teaching in Mark chapter 10 verses 2 through 12. We might also notice that in the Mark passage, Jesus included the possibility that a wife might divorce her husband, whereas this was not discussed in Matthew chapter 19 verses 3 through 12. Furthermore, in the Matthew passage, it was Jesus who switched the language of command to allowance, whereas in the Mark passage, Jesus asked the Pharisees what was commanded, and they responded by saying that Moses allowed divorce. Now, for me, these differences indicate that these were separate instances and not the same instance as described by two different gospel writers, but whether I'm correct in that assumption or not, Jesus' understanding of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4, has been consistently preserved in both accounts. First, Jesus agreed with those of his contemporaries who recognized that Moses allowed divorce in some circumstances, but that the covenant of Sinai never commanded divorce in any circumstance. Furthermore, Jesus revealed to his contemporaries and through this exchange to us that God had not intended divorce from the beginning, but rather that God had intended that a man and a woman once married would never divorce. As we recognized in our discussion of the underlying Hebrew of Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4, the word translated divorce in English meant literally to cut or to cut off in Hebrew. Jesus revealed to us that the act of divorce was an attempt to undo something God had done. In marriage, God had made the man and the woman one flesh, but in divorce, humanity had cut the one flesh back into two. Jesus, therefore, suggested that divorce was a human act that attempted to undo something God himself had done. This confused Jesus' contemporaries because Jesus seemed to be suggesting that Moses allowed them to do something in the covenant of Sinai that in reality was a violation of God's original intention for marriage, and even more, something that attempted to undo the work of God. So they asked Jesus to explain to them why Moses would permit something that went against God's intention and work. Jesus explained to them that God allowed this, that is, that God allowed this to go unpunished under the covenant of Sinai because the people were hard-hearted. But Jesus revealed this was a condescension of God and did not represent God's original intention for marriage. Then Jesus went on to say in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for unchastity and marries another commits adultery. And in Mark chapter 10 verse 11, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. What did Jesus mean by the phrase except for unchastity in Matthew chapter 19 verse 9? The Greek word translated into English as unchastity is porneia. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek a few hundred years before Jesus was born, the word porneia was used 49 times, so it's not uncommon. And in that version of the First Testament, called the Septuagint and quite commonly used by the Jewish communities in the time of Jesus, porneia was used mostly to translate the Hebrew terms which refer either to prostitution or to consensual sex between unmarried people. In the New Testament, especially in the epistles of St. Paul, the term seems to have been used as a blanket term for any and all sexual activity which had formerly been prohibited by the covenant of Sinai. The activities included in the umbrella term porneia all required execution by the stipulations of the covenant of Sinai. However, in Jesus' day, the Jewish people were no longer self-governing, and though there are recorded historical instances of Jewish populations occasionally taking matters into their own hands, by and large death penalty cases were supposed to be brought to Roman authorities, and the Romans did not have the same ethical values with respect to sexual behavior as the covenant of Sinai had described. So in Jesus' day, many behaviors that would have required execution under the covenant of Sinai did not under the jurisdiction of the Roman government. It seems to me that Jesus recognized that such behaviors, which would have required execution under the covenant of Sinai, had already severed the union between husband and wife or wife and husband, and therefore that divorce would not accomplish anything more than had already been accomplished by the actions of one or both of the participants in those circumstances. However, Jesus did go on to suggest that marriage after divorce, except in the case that the oneness of the two had already been cut due to sexual sins which required execution under the covenant of Sinai, was an act of adultery technically. This again relates back to our primary passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Moses suggested there that a woman could not remarry her first husband after marrying a second because she had been defiled. According to Jesus, it was the second marriage itself which had defiled her. Though remarriage after divorce was not an act of adultery under the covenant of Sinai, it was an act of adultery nonetheless in the eyes of God. This, according to Jesus, is why Moses prohibited a divorced woman who had married a second husband from marrying again her first husband. What is perhaps most surprising in Moses' teaching is that this was prohibited even in the case that her second husband died, given that in both the First and the New Testaments, death permanently voids a marriage and allows for the surviving spouse to marry again. However, Jesus' teaching makes this clearer as well, because for Jesus, the act of remarriage itself involved adultery, and it is the adultery which separates the first husband and wife permanently. If God had not condescended to human weakness, the second marriage itself would have been considered adultery and required execution. But according to Jesus, God relented on that requirement, allowing the second marriage, but prohibiting remarriage to the first husband. In both passages in Matthew and in Mark, Jesus' disciples were bothered by these teachings and asked him about them later. Matthew has recorded the disciples as suggesting that if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better not to marry. It would seem the disciples understood Jesus' insistence that God intended marriage to be for life quite well. And given this, in their estimation, perhaps it would be better not to marry at all. And Jesus' response to them was telling. He seems to have suggested that his disciples either had to accept this teaching or commit themselves to lifelong lives of celibacy. For Jesus, the truth is the truth, however hard it might be to accept or to embody. In both the covenant of Sinai and in the teachings of Jesus, we're shown that marriage between a man and a woman was intended to be a permanent covenant sealed by a permanent bond for the entirety of the couple's life on this earth. Sin, of course, interrupted this intention of God, and God was not unsympathetic to the problems sin has long introduced into the marriage relationship. Due to this understanding on the part of God, God allowed the Israelites to divorce. However, if divorce was chosen, there were consequences that had to be accepted. Under the covenant of Sinai, the divorcing person was not allowed to remarry his or her, in Jesus' teachings, first spouse if they had married another during the interval. Why not? Because technically, the remarriage was an act of adultery. God did not require that a person be punished for this adultery under the covenant of Sinai, but it still had repercussions. The first spouse had to treat the second spouse thereafter as permanently separated from him or her for life. Now, the question which might remain for Christians is this: does God still condescend to Christians in the ways he did to Israel? In other words, even though divorce is not part of God's design, does he still allow this breach to occur without penalty among his people? Well, it seems the answer may be both yes and no. Yes, the New Testament seems to recognize that because of sin, divorces may still occur among the followers of Jesus. But no, these divorces are not without consequence. For instance, St. Paul the Apostle wrote the following in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 17. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, But if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I and not the Lord, meaning that Paul didn't have a specific teaching from Jesus on this, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you may save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife. However that may be, let each of you lead the life that the Lord has assigned, to which God called you. This is my rule in all the churches. Now, if you wish to hear the fullness of my thoughts on this passage, I'll provide a link to a previous sermon that I preached specifically on these teachings. However, suffice it to say that the essence of St. Paul's teachings here are consistent with those of Jesus. St. Paul even recognized in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 11, that Jesus discouraged divorce and prohibited remarriage after divorce unless the remarriage was back to the original spouse. This is consistent with all we've seen in Jesus' teachings preserved in Matthew and in Mark. However, St. Paul does seem to have recognized that divorce would occur within the community of faith, despite God's original intentions to the contrary, and if it did, then there were certain requirements that needed to be observed. First, divorcees should not marry again while the first spouse lived. Second, in the case of marriage between a believer and an unbeliever, the believer should not file for divorce, but neither should the believer attempt to prevent the unbeliever from filing. In the case that the unbeliever seeks divorce, the believer is no longer bound. What that means remains a matter of debate, and if you're interested in my thoughts, I refer you to the sermon on this passage that I'll provide in the episode description. Furthermore, though St. Paul does not address the matter, possibly due to the fact that he did not expect followers of Jesus to participate in what the Greek calls porneia, that is, unlawful sexual activities, it is possible that Jesus' observation that porneia already severs the union of husband and wife, that might also continue to allow for divorce as the covenant of Sinai had permitted previously. Again, that's debated as well. Now, with all of this said, there appears to have been another consequence of divorce for the apostles of Jesus. According to St. Paul, those who would be overseers or elders in Christian communities, both must be married only once. It would appear that this not only precluded those in polygamous relationships from serving as leaders in Christian communities, but also those who had been divorced and remarried. So was divorce permissible in early Christian communities? Most likely yes, but was divorce and remarriage permitted without consequence? Most certainly no. May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.